I'm Caroline Hayes, 29 years old, and 2 months ago my sister looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't live here anymore." She set a cardboard box in front of me like she was serving a dish she'd been waiting to plate for years. Inside were scraps of my life, a toothbrush, a sweater, a few journals I hadn't touched since college. My parents sat beside her in silence, not angry, not surprised, just tired, like they'd already rehearsed this scene without me. I didn't argue, didn't cry. I stood up, picked up the box, and walked out the door. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family. I was born and raised in a small town outside Minneapolis, the younger of 2 girls. My sister Madison was the one with the perfect ponytail and the straight-A report cards. She joined debate club in 8th grade, went to state championships, and already had her law school picked out by senior year. I was different. Quiet, curious, always scribbling poems in the back of my notebooks, or getting caught reading under the desk when I was supposed to be paying attention. My parents didn't scold me much, they just looked disappointed, like they couldn't quite figure out where I came from. They never said it, but the contrast was clear. Madison was the plan. I was the question mark. Still, I believed in kindness, in showing up for people even when they didn't ask. That's what my grandfather taught me. He was my mom's dad, a retired English teacher with a crooked smile and shelves full of books. Every Sunday we'd walk the neighborhood and he'd let me read my stories out loud. He never told me to be more like Madison. He told me to pay attention to the small things, the way leaves changed color, the way silence said more than words sometimes. He gave me my first journal when I was 10. Leather-bound, no lines, just pages waiting to be filled. I still have it. After high school, Madison went off to Northwestern on a scholarship. I stayed local, enrolled in a state college, and majored in creative writing. My parents didn't say much. I think they were hoping it was a phase. When it wasn't, they stopped asking what I was working on. The year Grandpa died, I was a sophomore. Madison gave a speech at the funeral. I just cried. Later, she hugged me and said, "Guess it's time you grew up." After graduation, I moved to Portland. Cheaper rent, a decent writing scene, a few editing gigs on the side. I picked up shifts at a bakery to cover bills. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I made it work for nearly 5 years without asking my parents for a thing. Then everything collapsed in about 6 weeks. My freelance contract got cut. Hours at the bakery dried up. And the person I lived with told me they were moving out and I needed to be gone by the 1st of the month. So I called home. To my surprise, Madison answered. She didn't sound warm, but she said I could stay for 3 months, just until you land on your feet. I packed what I could into 4 suitcases, booked a bus ticket, and told myself it was a reset, that I'd get back on track. But when I walked through the front door, no one said welcome home. Madison handed me a typed list of house rules. My room, my childhood bedroom, was filled with storage boxes. At dinner, my mom mentioned I could apply for a temp job at Madison's firm. My dad just said, "You still writing?" and went back to his plate. I told myself it was temporary. Just a few weeks. Just until I got back on my feet. But something about that house felt colder than I remembered, and the silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate. I didn't know it then, but the moment I turned that thermostat up to 72 degrees was the moment everything shifted. The first real fight started over the thermostat. I'd turned it up to 72. It was one of those damp Minnesota evenings where the cold settles in your bones and no amount of blankets seemed to help. I was on the couch with my laptop trying to finish an editing gig for a small press newsletter when Madison came in, arms crossed, eyes already narrowed. "Are you serious?" she said. "We don't need to heat the whole house for your comfort." I looked up, still half in work mode, and said, "It's just 72. I was freezing. She didn't budge. This is exactly the problem. You don't think about what you're not paying for. That stung. I had been paying something $300 a month toward utilities just like she asked. I kept the bathroom clean, helped cook dinner when I could, and made sure I was out of the common spaces by 10, like her typed rules had laid out. "I'm trying," I said, not raising my voice but feeling it tighten. "You act like I'm just lounging around doing nothing. I've sent out more job applications this week than I can count." Madison scoffed. "More blog posts, maybe." She didn't even look at me when she said it. "Your whole life is one long excuse wrapped in creativity." I stood up then. My heart was pounding my hands a little shaky. "You have no idea how hard I've worked just to keep going." She looked at me like I'd said something ridiculous. "Survive. You came back here with nothing, expecting handouts, living in a house you don't pay for, taking up space you haven't earned. Don't talk to me about survival." Something snapped. "You've hated me since we were kids," I said, "because Grandpa believed in me, because he spent time with me, and you couldn't stand it." Her expression changed just for a second. Something flickered behind her eyes, but it was gone just as fast. "You're delusional," she said. "You think this is about Grandpa?" She took a step forward, voice lower, calmer. "I'm done arguing with you. We're having a family meeting tomorrow. It's time we make things clear." She turned and walked away, not waiting for a response. I sat on the couch long after she was gone. The room had gone still, but inside I felt like something was shifting. I stayed up most of the night, my laptop closed, the TV off, just staring at the dark corners of the ceiling. By morning I could already feel it. The house was too clean, the kind of clean that comes before company or before something formal. The dining table was empty except for 3 glasses of water and a notepad in the center. Madison sat at the head of the table wearing one of her work blazers. My parents were on either side of her. They didn't say good morning. "Sit down, Caroline," Madison said. I sat. My chest felt tight. "We've been talking," she began, folding her hands, "and it's clear that this living arrangement isn't working." I looked at my mother, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "My father just rubbed his temple like he had a headache," Madison went on. "You've been here nearly 2 months. You said you needed a few weeks. There's been no meaningful progress." "That's not true," I said. "I've been applying to jobs. I picked up freelance work. I'm doing everything I said I would." "You've brought tension into this house," she said. "You've refused help. You act like a victim in every situation." "What are you talking about?" I said, my voice cracking a little. "Refused help. You mock everything I try to do." Madison stood. She walked into the living room, then came back holding a cardboard box. She placed it in front of me. Inside were my notebooks, a toothbrush, socks, my phone charger, the same leather journal Grandpa gave me when I was 10. "You don't live here anymore," she said. "You have no home with us." I looked at my parents. My mother blinked like she might say something but didn't. My father finally spoke. "It's for the best, Caroline," he said. "This house, it's not good for tension." I looked down at the box, my life in a few scattered pieces. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I stood up slowly, picked up the box, and said the only thing I could. "You planned this." Madison didn't flinch. "We gave you time. You didn't use it." "No," I said. "You gave me rules, deadlines, shame, not a chance." No one moved. I walked to the door. My palms were damp. I thought I might drop the box, but I held on. I didn't look back until I was outside. The door shut behind me with a soft click. It was cold on the porch. I stood there holding the box, staring at the house where I had grown up. The windows I used to watch snow fall through. The front step where Grandpa and I sat with popsicles in summer. And for the first time, I felt like those memories belonged to someone else, someone who used to live there but didn't anymore. I found a motel on the edge of town, one of those places with buzzing lights and threadbare towels. I didn't sleep. I just laid on top of the blanket with the box beside me. I kept thinking they'd call. that one of them would text. But my phone stayed quiet, and sometime after midnight when the heater kicked on and the buzz of the hallway TV faded, I realized this wasn't a warning. It was done. They'd closed the door. What I didn't know, what none of them could have expected, was that something else had just opened. It came in the form of an email, and it had my grandfather's name in the subject line. I opened the email, expecting another job rejection, maybe a receipt from some account I'd forgotten to cancel. But the subject line stopped me cold. R.E. Walter Hayes Trust. Immediate attention required. It was from a woman named Erica Davis, an associate attorney at a law firm I didn't recognize. At first I thought it had to be some kind of mistake, spam maybe. But then I saw my full name in the greeting, and just beneath it the words, "A provision in the trust has recently triggered review due to your current living circumstances." I read the email 3 times before I believed it was real. My grandfather, my mom's dad, had been gone for almost a decade. No one in the family had ever mentioned a trust. At the funeral, there was no talk of inheritance, no reading of a will. Madison had given a eulogy that made it sound like he'd been just a sweet old man who liked crossword puzzles. But I remembered him differently. I remembered long walks around the neighborhood. I remembered the way he'd read my stories out loud like they mattered. And now this something he'd left behind for me, something waiting for the right moment. I stayed up most of the night at that motel, the email open on my phone, the room humming with the sound of the heater. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like the threat of something he'd left in case everything else fell apart. By 9 the next morning, I was sitting outside a coffee shop, hands wrapped around a paper cup phone pressed to my ear. Erica answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was calm, professional, but kind. "Caroline." She said, "Thank you for returning my message. We've reviewed the trust your grandfather left behind. It includes 2 provisions that apply only to you." I didn't say anything. I just listened. The first, she continued, is a property. A home in Forest Hill deeded entirely in your name. The second is a fund established to support your creative work. I felt my throat tighten. Why now, I asked. Why am I only hearing about this now? There was a pause. The trust was sealed upon his death with a trigger built in. That trigger activated once we were notified that you had been removed from your family residence without consent. That condition has now been met. It took a moment for her words to land. He had known. Years ago, before any of this, he must have seen what I couldn't. He knew how things would go. He knew Madison. He knew my parents. And he knew that one day I might need something no one else would give me an escape. Erica emailed the paperwork that afternoon. By the end of the week, I had the keys in my hand. The house was nothing fancy. A small 2-bedroom bungalow with weathered siding and a porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. The front yard had weeds sprouting through the cracks in the walkway, and the paint on the shutters was peeling in wide strips. But it was mine. The deed had my name on it. The front door opened with a key that only I held. There were no house rules taped to the fridge, no clipped instructions, no one watching the clock while I ate breakfast. That first night, I slept on the hardwood floor with a borrowed pillow and a blanket from the thrift store down the road. I didn't unpack much, just a notebook, a change of clothes, and the old leather journal Grandpa gave me when I was 10. The house made noises, pipes settling, wind shifting through the eaves, but I didn't mind. It felt like the house had been waiting, and now we were both breathing again. The fund Grandpa left wasn't enormous, but it was more than I'd had in years, enough to fix the roof, replace the stove, and buy a used laptop that didn't shut off when the charger wiggled. I set up a small workspace by the window folding table, secondhand chair stack of pens and yellow notepads. Nothing fancy, but steady, quiet. I started writing again. Not the kind of writing I'd been doing before, not polished pitches or carefully edited pieces made to impress someone on the other end of an inbox. I wrote what I wanted, about shame, about silence, about the weight of being told you don't belong. I wrote about the motel, the cardboard box, the words Madison had said. I didn't dress them up or try to make them sound pretty. I just told the truth. I posted the first piece on a simple blog. Free template, no design work, just words. I didn't expect much, maybe a few clicks, a couple of friends reading out of kindness. But then comments started coming in. People wrote things like, "This is my story," or "I've never felt so seen." A woman from Ohio sent me an email saying her sister had called her dead weight and she hadn't spoken to her since. Another said she kept her journals in her closet, afraid her family would laugh if they found them. I wasn't alone. One night, I took a chance and submitted one of the essays to a literary journal I'd admired for years but never dared approach. A month later, I got the email, "Accepted." The word blinked on my screen like a lighthouse. I printed the acceptance and taped it to the fridge right where Madison's list of house rules used to hang. Not long after, I got a letter from Madison's attorney. Polite, formal, full of legal phrases like mutual understanding and trust interpretation. I read it twice and then folded it back into the envelope. I didn't respond. A few weeks after that, a birthday card showed up with no return address. It was from my mother. Inside was a check for $100 and a line that said, "Hope you're okay." I placed the check on the shelf, still untouched. I didn't hear anything from my father, but somehow that didn't surprise me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to belong to them. I was learning to belong to myself. And one snowy morning, as the frost settled on the windows, I opened Grandpa's old journal and found his handwriting on the inside cover. For Caroline, may you never write to be accepted, only to be free. I ran my fingers over the words, not crying, not smiling, just sitting with the quiet truth of it. I wasn't that girl on the porch anymore holding a box waiting to be let back in. I was someone else now, and I was just getting started. It didn't happen all at once, that feeling the shift. It crept in slowly like light through thin curtains. I'd wake up without panic sitting on my chest. I'd make coffee and realize I didn't have to tiptoe. No one was keeping track of how many eggs I used, or what time I went to bed, or whether I'd filled out another application that day. The silence wasn't sharp anymore. It was still. And after everything that had happened, that stillness felt new. I set small goals, not grand sweeping ones, just things I could finish in a day. Fix the leaky kitchen faucet, sort through the books I'd hauled from the motel, write a page even if I didn't know what it was yet. The work didn't look like much from the outside, but something in me was beginning to steady. One afternoon, I was unpacking an old storage bin when I found a manila envelope tucked between spiral notebooks. I must have thrown it in during the rush out of my parents' house. Inside were some of my old short stories, not drafts or fragments, finished pieces I hadn't read in years. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and started going through them one by one. Some made me wince, some made me smile, but all of them felt like pieces of someone I'd almost forgotten. That night, I reopened my blog. The last post had gone up over a month earlier, the one that had gotten all the comments from strangers, from people saying, "This happened to me too." I started typing, not for them, not to prove anything, just to say what had been sitting in my chest for too long. I wrote about the motel, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the sound of someone yelling in the next room over a frozen dinner. I wrote about the cardboard box Madison had placed in front of me, how she hadn't raised her voice, how my mother hadn't stopped her, how my father's voice had gone flat. I didn't frame it as a tragedy. I didn't call it betrayal. I just told it straight. And when I hit publish, I didn't wait to see who read it. I shut my laptop and made tea. A few days later, I got a message from someone named Joanna. She ran a community arts newsletter in the Midwest. She'd read the blog and wanted to feature one of the pieces. We talked on the phone for half an hour. She said it was refreshing to hear writing that didn't sound polished within an inch of its life. She meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. After that, the requests started coming in slowly first, from small local journals, then from a podcast that read essays out loud, then from a nonprofit that wanted someone to help edit their grant proposals. None of it was flashy, but it was steady. It was work, and it was mine. The house, too, began to come together. I painted the kitchen cabinets a soft green, found an old table at a yard sale and sanded it down on the back porch, bought a small second-hand armchair that became my new favorite writing spot. Some nights I'd light a candle, pull out Grandpa's journal, and just sit beside it, even if I wasn't writing anything new. One morning, I walked into town to drop off a letter at the post office. On the way back, I passed a young woman sitting on the curb outside a laundromat, her shoulders hunched, a backpack at her feet. She looked tired, not just physically, but all over. I stopped a few paces ahead, thinking of how I'd felt that night outside my parents' house, box in hand. Nowhere to go. I didn't say anything to her, just nodded gently when our eyes met and kept walking. But I carried her face with me the rest of the day. That evening, I opened a fresh document and started something new. Not a blog post, not an essay, something longer. I didn't have a title, just a feeling. I wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Around midnight, I stood in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hope the house is treating you well. Let's talk." Madison. I stood there, phone in hand, water forgotten. I didn't respond. Not that night. Not the next day either. But it stayed in my phone, marked unread. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure what I owed her, if anything. A week later, a manila envelope showed up in my mailbox. This one from a law firm in Chicago. It was formal, all legalese requesting a meeting to review the trust and establish cooperative terms regarding property and disbursements. I read it through once, then folded it back up and slid it into a drawer. I went back to my writing. Fall came early that year. The trees in Forest Hill turned quicker than they did back home, deep rust red and gold that lined the streets like something out of a postcard. I started going for walks every morning, just a mile or two. Sometimes I'd bring my phone and record voice notes, bits of dialogue or story ideas. Sometimes I left it behind and just listened to the quiet. I passed a little bookstore on the edge of Main Street one morning and noticed a help wanted sign in the window. Part-time afternoons only. I stepped inside just to ask. The owner was a woman in her 60s named Ruth. She'd run the place for years, knew every title by heart. We talked for a few minutes, and before I left, she said, "You've got a calm about you." We could use that here. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. And it meant I could stop worrying about stretching the last of the fund. That afternoon, I stood behind the counter, alphabetizing a stack of used paperbacks, when a woman picked up one of the local magazines we stocked. It had my essay in it. She read the first paragraph out loud to her friend. "I think I know who wrote this," she said. I didn't say anything, just listened. Then I turned back to the shelf. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, steam rising from a cup of tea beside me. I thought about all the times I'd tried to twist myself into the shape of what someone else thought I should be, and how none of it had ever stuck. The house was still. No footsteps overhead, no doors slamming, no clipped voices from the other room. It was just me. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The morning I went to the post office, I wasn't expecting anything. Just a stack of junk mail and the usual circulars from local shops. But there was a white envelope tucked in the middle, my name printed neatly on the front, no return address. I opened it on the walk home, and inside was a birthday card. A basic one. Blue background gold lettering, the kind you'd find in a gas station rack. Tucked inside was a check for $100. The only thing written was a note. Hope you're okay. Mom. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a minute, the card still open in my hands. A breeze caught the flap and moved it back and forth like it was trying to wave. I folded it shut, slid it back into the envelope, and put it in my jacket pocket. That night I placed it on the shelf next to the drawer that held the letter from Madison's attorney. Neither had been answered. At the bookstore, things picked up a little. Ruth asked if I'd be interested in running the weekly email newsletter, and I said yes. It was something I could do from home early mornings or late evenings. I added a few book reviews, a community spotlight, and a staff recommends section that gave me a reason to write little blurbs about novels I loved. People responded well. They wrote in asking about certain titles. One woman sent in a request to have the newsletter printed and mailed to her mother, who didn't use email. I started seeing familiar names pop up in my blog's comment section. Not just readers, but subscribers from the store's list. Some had figured out I was the same Caroline. Others didn't mention it, but I could tell by the way they wrote. They knew. One afternoon, after helping a customer carry a box of used books to her car, I found Ruth flipping through a stack of printed blog posts I'd left behind the counter. She looked up and said, "You ever think about collecting these? Putting them in one place?" I shrugged and said I hadn't. But that night, I stayed up late outlining a rough table of contents. The house was quiet, just the sound of my pen moving across paper and the wind brushing the trees outside. I found myself reaching for Grandpa's journal again. Not to write in it, but to sit with it beside me. That sentence inside the cover, "right to be free, not accepted," had started to mean something new. Then a few weeks later, the doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday morning early. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I opened the door in my robe, a cup of coffee still in hand. On the porch stood a delivery driver with a clipboard and a padded envelope. I signed for it without much thought and closed the door. Inside was another letter from Madison's lawyer. This one was different. It wasn't cold or combative. It was polite. Too polite. The wording was carefully chosen, as if every line had been reviewed twice. "We believe a conversation may be beneficial at this time regarding cooperative access to the property and financial terms of the trust." I read it through, then read it again. It didn't say anything directly, but the meaning was clear. She wanted something, and she wasn't going to ask me for it directly. Later that week, I was helping restock shelves at the store when Ruth noticed me checking my phone more than usual. She didn't ask questions, just gave me a look that said, "Take the time you need." I walked the few blocks home, the letter in my coat pocket, the air cool and dry. I sat at the kitchen table and laid everything out. The first letter, the birthday card, this new envelope. 3 pieces of communication after months of silence. None of them said sorry. None of them asked how I was. But they all arrived after the same thing had happened, after the blog started gaining attention, after the publication, after the house became real. I took out a notepad and wrote one sentence at the top. What do I want to do about this? Then I stared at it for a while. That weekend, I drove to a small cabin outside Stillwater. It was quiet. No internet, no distractions. Just me, a stack of notebooks, and enough firewood for 3 nights. I sat by the wood stove and wrote every day pages and pages, not about Madison, not about the trust, but about everything else. I wrote about the way Grandpa used to peel oranges with a pocket knife and hand me each slice like it was treasure. I wrote about the time I got caught in a rainstorm, walking home from the library, and how the smell of wet pavement always brings me back there. I wrote because I could. On the last morning, I packed up my things, folded my pages into a binder, and locked the cabin behind me. Back at home, I took one final look at the letter from Madison's lawyer. Then I placed it in the same drawer as the others, and I closed it. I didn't answer. Instead, I drafted a new post, one about boundaries, about how sometimes silence is the answer, about how not responding doesn't mean you're afraid. It means you've already chosen your peace. I hit publish, and then I opened a fresh document. The day I got the email from the Lakeshore Review, I was kneeling in the garden pulling up a stubborn patch of crabgrass near the fence. The subject line popped up on my phone, "Congratulations, you're in." I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it right there in the dirt. They were accepting one of my longer essays, something I'd written during that weekend at the cabin. I read the message twice before it sank in. That night, I taped the acceptance next to the first one on my refrigerator. Same corner, same little piece of blue painter's tape. I stood back and looked at both side by side. One had felt like proof. The other felt like momentum. A few days later, Ruth asked if I could cover the store solo for a full afternoon. She had a doctor's appointment and wasn't sure how long it would run. I said yes, and we went over the closing checklist together. Before she left, she patted my arm and said, "You're good with people, even when you don't say much." It was the kind of compliment that landed quietly but stayed with me. The store was slow that day. A couple of regulars, a woman buying greeting cards, a teenager picking up a used copy of The Bell Jar. Midway through the shift, a man in a suit came in, late 40s, maybe early 50s, polished shoes, leather briefcase. I greeted him with the usual, but he didn't respond, just browsed the front table, then the local author's shelf. A few minutes later, he brought a copy of Essays from the North to the counter. When I rang him up, he looked at me directly and said, "You're Caroline Hayes?" I nodded, surprised. He handed me his business card. "I represent your sister," he said. "We've reached out a few times." I held the card without saying anything. "She'd like to speak with you in person." I didn't answer right away. I handed him his receipt and said, "Store closes at 6. You're welcome to look around until then." He didn't push, just nodded once, put the card back in his pocket and left. I locked the door behind him. When I told Ruth about it later, she didn't ask for details. She just listened and said, "Be careful." That kind of calm usually comes with conditions. That weekend I visited the house again, the one Grandpa left me. I hadn't really left, but it felt like I was seeing it fresh. I took a slow walk through each room, touching the window frames, the corners where the walls met the ceiling. I thought about how little I'd known when I first stepped through that door, and how much had changed since. I opened my laptop that night and wrote a new post. This one was different. Not a story, not a memory, just a single question at the top. What happens when silence becomes your strength? It was short, only a few paragraphs, but it spread faster than anything I'd written before. People shared it, quoted it. Someone screen printed it on a tote bag and tagged me in a photo. I didn't know what to do with that, so I bookmarked it and closed the app. Then the call came. It was a Monday morning just past 10. I was slicing apples in the kitchen when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. It was Madison. Her voice was calm, practiced. She said she hoped I was well, said she'd been following my writing, said she'd like to sit down, woman to woman, and clear the air. I replayed it once, then set my phone down and finished making breakfast. The next day, a letter arrived, handwritten this time, folded in thirds. She said she regretted how things ended, that it had been a difficult season for everyone, that she thought maybe now that we both had space we could rebuild. I tucked the letter in a drawer with the others. Later that week, I was shelving books at the store when Ruth came in from the back with a small box. Inside were 3 copies of the Lakeshore Review. My essay was the opening piece. She placed one on the front display with a post-it note that read, "Our own Caroline." I didn't say anything, just smiled. That evening, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea and Grandpa's journal resting on my lap. The sun was low, the air cool. I opened to the middle, not looking for anything, just flipping pages. A loose sheet fell out, one I must have tucked in years ago. It was a note I'd written to myself in college. A list, really. 5 things I wanted by the time I turned 30. A room of my own, something published, a job that let me sleep at night, to stop apologizing for existing, to feel free even once. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it up and slid it into the front of the journal behind Grandpa's note. The next morning, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of pride, just clarity. I called Madison's lawyer and left a message. I told him there would be no meeting. The trust was not up for renegotiation. The property was no longer shared in spirit, memory, or legal structure. I told him to put it in writing. Then I hung up, and I got back to work. A week after I called Madison's lawyer, I received a formal confirmation in the mail. No meeting would be scheduled. No revisions to the trust would be pursued. The letter was brief, no apology, no explanation, just a statement of acknowledgement and a closing line. Thank you for your clarity on this matter. I folded it neatly, slipped it into a file folder with the others, and set it on the bookshelf next to my desk. Then I opened my laptop and returned to my manuscript. That same day, Ruth called to tell me someone had dropped off a package at the bookstore with my name on it. No note, no return address. I stopped by after closing, and she handed it over with a curious look. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a photo, one I hadn't seen in years. It was from the summer before Grandpa passed. We were on the back porch, him with his feet up on the railing and me beside him, holding one of my old stories in my lap. I recognized Madison's handwriting on the back, summer 14, Evelyn's last good year. I held the photo for a long time, unsure if it was meant as a gesture of peace or a final jab. Either way, I didn't keep it. I placed it in the return bin behind the counter and left it there. 2 days later, my mother called. Her name lit up on my screen like a ghost I hadn't invited. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. A few minutes later, the message came through. She said she missed me. Said she'd read one of my pieces through a friend at church. Said it reminded her of when I used to read aloud in the living room, curled up on the floor with a flashlight and a notebook. She didn't say sorry. She didn't mention the meeting, the box, or the silence that followed. She just said, "I hope we'll talk soon, if you want." I saved the voicemail, but I didn't call back. That Sunday, I had dinner with Ruth and her husband at their place outside town. Roast chicken, sweet potatoes, and a pie I helped slice but didn't bake. Afterward, we sat on their porch while the wind moved through the pine trees. Ruth handed me a mug of tea and said, "You know, Caroline, sometimes family isn't where you start. It's where you land." The next morning, I opened my email to find an invitation from Voices Quarterly asking me to be part of a virtual panel on writing through personal loss. They'd read several of my essays, and someone had recommended me for the spot. It wasn't something I had applied for. I read the email twice before replying. I said yes. The panel was held over video, 5 of us from different corners of the country talking about our work, our past, our process. I was nervous at first, but once the conversation started, something shifted. The words came easily. I talked about storytelling memory, the weight of unspoken things. I shared pieces of my experience, but I kept it measured, just enough. When it was over, one of the other panelists stayed behind to thank me. She said, "You said something that made me feel like I could write again." That stayed with me. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the local community center inviting me to lead a free workshop on personal writing. The director said she'd read my work through the bookstore's newsletter and thought it might resonate with some of the older women who gathered each week. I agreed to do it just once to see how it went. That Wednesday afternoon, 6 women showed up, some in their 60s, a few in their 70s, one with a notepad that had clearly seen years of use. We sat in a circle, and I asked them to write for 10 minutes about a moment they had never spoken aloud. They wrote quietly, some with furrowed brows, others with tears they didn't explain. At the end, one of them said, I haven't written anything since my husband passed. This felt like coming back to life. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders and reread one of my early posts, the one I'd written the day after moving into the house. I barely recognized that version of me, not because I was ashamed of her, but because she felt so far away now. Then the doorbell rang. It was nearly 9. I stood heart-thudding just a little and opened the door. Madison stood on the porch. Her hands were empty. No clipboard, no envelope, no lawyer beside her. Just her. Same polished hair, same steady posture, but something different in her eyes. She looked tired. Not in the way a person looks after a long day, but in the way someone looks after a long stretch of pretending everything's fine. "Can I come in?" she asked. I didn't answer. I stepped aside. She walked slowly into the living room, glanced around like she hadn't expected it to look the way it did. I let the silence sit for a moment before asking, "Why are you here?" She looked at me, hands clasped in front of her. I read everything she said. "I know I'm not the person you wanted to hear from, but I didn't want a lawyer to speak for me anymore." She paused, looked at the bookshelf, then back at me. "You were right," she said quietly. "About Grandpa. About how I hated how much he saw you." The words hung there. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she added. "I just wanted to say it." I nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. She didn't stay long. 5 minutes, maybe less. When she left, she didn't hug me. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said, "Thank you for letting me say it in person." I watched her walk down the path to the driveway. She didn't turn back. I closed the door behind her, the sound of it soft, final. And I stood in the quiet of my house, knowing something had shifted. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't healing. But it was an ending I hadn't expected. I didn't expect to feel anything after Madison left. No rush of relief, no weight lifting off my chest. Just stillness, the kind that settles in once a storm passes, not peace exactly, but space. That night, I didn't write. I didn't reread her letter or replay her voice in my head. I made tea. I read a chapter from an old novel. I sat by the window and listened to the wind move through the trees. I let the quiet stay quiet. The next morning, I found myself pulling out the leather journal Grandpa had given me. The pages were soft from years of use, the corners curled. I flipped through them slowly, passing scribbled poems, story outlines, thoughts I'd once been too afraid to say aloud. On the inside cover, his handwriting was still there. For Caroline. "May you never write to be accepted, only to be free." I ran my thumb over the words. I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission anymore. Not Madison's, not my parents', not the world's. I had built something slowly, quietly out of the pieces they left behind. A home, a voice, a way forward. That fall, the community center asked me to lead a second workshop. More women came this time. Some brought friends. One brought a stack of letters she'd never mailed, folded neatly in an old shoebox. Another shared a story she'd never told anyone, not even her children. We didn't rush. We sat in the quiet. We listened. One afternoon after class, a woman pulled me aside and said, "You make people feel like they're allowed to matter." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But later, walking home, I thought about how long it had taken for me to believe that about myself. A few days before the holidays, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a card with a photo of a house in snow-white shutters, soft light in the windows. Inside one sentence, "I hope it's warm there." It wasn't signed. But I recognized my mother's handwriting. I didn't frame it or fold it away. I simply placed it in the drawer and closed it gently. I didn't need her to explain. I didn't need more than what she could give. Sometimes the apology never comes in the words you imagined. Sometimes it shows up quiet, unfinished, but still real. I spent New Year's Eve alone that year, and it didn't feel empty. I made a small dinner, lit a candle, and wrote down 10 things I was proud of. None of them had to do with publishing. None of them were about proving anything. They were all about presence, about showing up, about staying kind even after being erased. And when the clock turned midnight, I didn't make a resolution. I just whispered thank you and turned off the light. To anyone listening, if you've ever stood on the porch holding your life in a cardboard box, if you've ever been told you don't belong, that your voice doesn't count, that you should have been more like someone else, I hope you know it's never too late to begin again. Not to prove something, not to win, just to be free. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to share it or leave a comment. And if you're carrying your own story in silence, maybe it's time to write it down. You never know who's waiting to hear it.